Tired of having textures that look like they were made by 5-year-olds? Well, I got you, Peanut Goblin. Let me just start off by saying that these are not necessarily the best or fastest methods, because when it comes to 3D art, there are many different workflows and methods to achieve similar results. But these are the methods that have worked for me, so I'm gonna teach them to you, you ungrateful piece of shit. Now, as per usual, we're gonna start off with software. There are a lot of 3D texturing software that you can use, and the most popular ones are 3D Coat, Quixel Mixer, and Substance Painter. Now, because I don't have much experience with 3D Coat or Quixel Mixer, and also because Substance Painter is industry standard, this video is gonna be totally focused on texturing with Substance Painter. But hold your horses. Before you click off this video because you don't want to get Substance Painter, this video will also have important texturing information that you could use regardless of the software that you plan to use. But before you get your grimy hands on Substance Painter, we have to first talk about the different types of textures. For one, we have to talk about the difference between textures and materials. Now you might be saying to yourself, aren't textures and materials the same thing? No, silly. They're not. Basically, textures are essentially images that are applied onto an object, while materials on the other hand are containers that encapsulate all of the textures in Engine. And with that in mind, there are also differences between tileable textures and tileable materials. Tileable textures are essentially textures that tile seamlessly horizontally and vertically, and on their own they can be applied onto materials in Engine and used as tileable materials. So Daryl, you never explain what the difference between a tileable texture and tileable material is. Well, shut the fuck up, I'm getting to that. So the biggest difference between a tileable texture and a tileable material is that if you tile a tileable texture in your 3D texturing software such as Substance Painter and you tile it by a lot, that's when your textures will start looking blurry. Because what your 3D texturing software is trying to do is cram all of your texture into a 2 or 4K image. But on the other hand, if you have tileable materials in Engine, you can tile them as much as you want without losing resolution. Why does that happen? I don't know. I'm not a tech guy, but the Engine basically does some voodoo dark magic techie stuff to tile your materials without losing quality. But essentially, your 3D texturing software allows you to use tileable textures to apply to specific parts of a model to create your own unique textures. So if you've been paying attention to this video, you should know that unique textures can't be tiled in Engine unless if you want your models to look like shit. But anyways, once you open up Substance Painter, close that fucking home screen, nobody needs that shit, and then you start by either dragging in your 3D model or going to File and clicking New. Now the first thing that you want to do is select your document resolution. Here you basically get to decide if you want your textures to be 2K, 4K, or any of the lower resolutions if you're a masochist. And then the second most important thing to do is to select your normal map format. Now the normal map format depends on which game engine you'll be exporting your textures to. So if you plan on exporting it to Unreal, select DirectX. But if you plan on exporting it to Unity or Godot, first of all, shame on you, but go ahead and pick OpenGL. The reason why this is a super important step is because if you choose the wrong normal map format, it will lead to having flipped normals. And then the next thing that you want to do is go all the way down to import settings and disable auto unwrap. Now this was pretty self-explanatory. You should be doing the UV unwrapping manually in your 3D modeling software and not letting Substance Painter auto unwrap for you. And before hitting OK, make sure that you have the 3D model that you want to texture selected. If you don't, then go all the way up to select and select the 3D model. It's not that hard. And boom, there you go. Now you have your model in Substance Painter. But before you do anything, you have to learn how to navigate in Substance Painter. So by default, you're gonna have two viewports in Substance Painter. The one on your left is your 3D viewport that lets you look at your 3D model, and the one on your right is your 2D viewport, which looks at your UV space. You can hit F1, F2, or F3 to go into 2D mode, 3D mode, or the original half 2D, half 3D mode thing. But in your 3D viewport, you can hit Alt and hold left click to look around. Alt and middle mouse button moves your camera, and you can hit F to focus back on your model. Additionally, if you want better lighting for your viewport, you can hold Shift and right click to change the direction of the light. And moving on to the windows in Substance Painter, now to your left you're gonna see the assets window, and here's essentially where you can find your materials, smart masks, filters, brushes, alphas, textures, environments, and fonts. Under your materials tab, you can also drag your materials onto the model itself to apply the material. Alternatively, you can also drag your materials into the layer layers window to apply your materials to the model itself. Which brings me on to the right side of the screen. Here you have your texture set list window, which essentially shows all of the texture sets that you have on your model, and below it is where you have your layers and your texture set settings. Now, if you've used Photoshop before, the layers window is exactly the same as the layers from Photoshop, and right below your layers window is your properties window. Here you can set the projection method of your material and the tiling, rotation, and offset of your material as well, and you can also change a bunch of different user defined parameters. But now that your goofy ass is familiarized with Substance Painter, it's time to bake your mesh maps. This is also the part where if you have a higher poly model, you can bake it down into a lower poly model. So in order to bake your mesh maps, all you have to do is go into mode and click on bake mesh maps. Or if you're a lazy motherfucker, you can hit F8. And then it's gonna bring you into this window. Now it's gonna look super complicated at first, but fret not, child. I got your back. On the top left is your texture set list window again. Here you can select which texture set you want to bake. And then directly below that is your mesh map bakers window. And here you can enable or disable whichever mesh maps that you want to bake. If you want to bake detailed foliage onto alpha cards, make sure that you have the opacity map enabled as well. And now onto your mesh map settings. The output size is pretty self-explanatory. It's the resolution that you want your mesh maps to be. Duh. And then right below that is your high definition meshes. So if you have a high poly mesh and you want to bake it down into your current mesh, click on the folder icon to the right and then select your high poly mesh. Also, if you don't know what baking is, I'll make a video covering that in the near future sometime in the future. But anyways, once you have your high poly model in, you can tweak the max frontal distance and the max rear distance. And you essentially just want to make sure that the cage of your low poly model covers the entire high poly model. And Substance Painter does a pretty good visualization on how much of the high poly mesh is covered. So as long as you don't see any red on your model, you're good. And once you have all of your settings configured, smack that bake select the textures button and congratulations! Now you're ready to texture your model. But Daryl, why do I have to bake mesh maps? Shut the fuck. The reason why you want to bake your mesh maps before you start modeling is because of generators. Now if you don't know what generators are, they basically generate a mask or material based on the topology of your mesh and also based on the mesh maps that you baked. Want to add a bunch of grunge and dirt onto your model? Add in a fill layer. Choose a color that resembles dirt and grunge. Max out that roughness value and then right click your fill layer, add a black mask and then right click on the black mask and add a generator to it, and then click on the large intimidating generator button and select dirt. And because we previously baked the model's mesh maps, you can see how the dirt is customized to match the ambient occlusion and curvature of the model. And there are also a lot of parameters that you could tweak under the dirt generator to get the look that you want. So play around with the dirt level, dirt contrast, grunge amount, and grunge scale until you're satisfied. Also, if your grunge appears to be cut off because of your UV seams, you can try to enable use triplanar to have seamless grunge transitions. I'll explain more about what triplanar is later on, but for now it really looks like voodoo magic. Now of course there are also a bunch of other different generators that you could use, but the few that I find myself commonly using are ambient occlusion, curvature, dirt, metal etchware, shrink wrap, UV borders, and the position generators. So feel free to have fun, go out, frolic in the field of generators, and experiment until you're satisfied with how your model looks. And once you're satisfied with how your model looks, now it's time to export your textures. So exporting your textures in Painter is actually pretty easy. All you have to do is go into File and Export Textures. That's it. It's not that hard. Or, again, if you're a lazy motherfucker, just hit Control, Shift, and E. Then you're gonna be presented with your Export Textures window. Now on your left is your global settings, and under that is all of the texture sets on your model. Here you can select which texture sets you want to export. And starting from the top, you have your output directory. This one's pretty self-explanatory. If I have to explain it to you, well, burn your computer. And then for your output template, you can select whichever engine or software that you plan to export your textures to. So if you want to export your textures to Unreal, just select Unreal Engine 4 pack. And if you want to export it to Unity, just make sure that you know which render pipeline your project is using and then export it to its respective render pipeline. But if you export it to Unreal, you're gonna have an AORM map, which basically has the AO map in the red channel, the roughness map in the green channel, and the metallic map in the blue channel. But you're gonna want to open the AORM map in Unreal and look for the SR RGB checkbox, and you want to uncheck that. Otherwise, your models are going to look extremely shiny and glossy. And congratulations, I'm proud of you, child. Now your models don't look like they're made by a 3-year-old. They look like they're made by an 8. On to the most fun part of the video, additional tips. If you have multiple layers of materials applied to your model and you don't want their normal maps or height maps to overlap, under your layers window, click on the base color drop down and select either normal map or height map depending on which ones you don't want to overlap. And then on the right of the top material, it's either going to be NMDT or LDGE depending on if you're on the normal tab or the height map tab. But regardless, you're going to want to click on that. That is the blending mode of the material, and you're going to want to click on normal, and voila, now you can have multiple materials without any overlapping normals or displacements. Now on to the second tip. If you want to texture a window on your model or anything that's translucent, what you're going to want to do is click on the shader settings. That is the second icon to your right. Click on the large intimidating ASM metal rough button, and then you're going to want to select PBM metal rough with alpha blending, and then you're going to want to select the texture set that will be translucent, and then click on the texture set settings window right beside your layers window. Scroll down until you see the channels tab, click on the plus icon and select opacity, and now create a new fill layer. Select whatever base color you want, lower the roughness down to give it that glossy look. You're also going to want to click on the OP button if it's disabled, and then scroll all the way down to the opacity section and lower it down to a lower value. Now on to the next tip. This is one that I've been struggling for a super long time and I couldn't find any resources online because I was a mega dumb. But if you're running into any shading issues after you bake your mesh maps, you might want to go back into your 3D modeling software and check your UV unwrap, because the shading issues are most likely caused by overlapping UVs. And when you bake your mesh maps in Substance Painter, some of the ambient occlusion shadows might get transferred to other parts of the model where it's not supposed to be, and then that's when you get weird black or gray spots on your model. But if you check your UV unwraps and none of your UVs are overlapping, go back into the bake mesh map section of Substance Painter and then click on the ambient occlusion mesh map and play around with the max occluder distance. Now moving on to the next tip, which is decals. If you go into the alpha section of your assets window, you have a bunch of alpha maps that you can apply onto your model as decals. So what I usually do is I drag them onto the model and I select mask. This allows me to go into the fill layer to play with the roughness, base color, metallic, and all of the other parameters in a non-destructive way. Now moving on to the final tip of the video, which is triplanar blending. So if you have an oddly shaped model and you have a bunch of UV seams on it and you want your textures to look seamless, click on the material and in your properties window, click on UV projection and select triplanar projection. And would you look at that? Ooh, voodoo man. But essentially what triplanar projection does is that it projects a texture onto a 3D model by using 3 different planar projections, each corresponding to a different axis. So the X, Y, and Z axes, and then it blends the transition seamlessly, essentially. Okay, I lied. That was not the final tip. And it's definitely not because I forgot to add this tip in. But the actual final tip is the polygon fill tool. So if you want to have specific materials applied to specific parts of your mesh, all you have to do is right click on your material, add a black mask, click on the polygon fill tool, and then here you can see you have 4 different fill modes, which are the triangle fill, polygon fill, mesh fill, and the UV fill. So essentially what the polygon fill tool does is that it allows you to select specific faces or specific meshes to apply the materials on. But essentially that's it. Now you can throw your beta textures away and replace them with your new Sigma textures. Thank you all for the support over the past couple of videos, and I'm gonna be honest with y'all, there's not that many tutorials that I can make in the long run, so I might pivot towards other game development or game art videos that are not entirely focused on teaching you guys, but I'll still throw in tidbits of education in the videos. So yeah, they might take a little longer to make than usual, and I'm also pretty busy with school and graduation stuff, so that's fun. But anyways, hope you guys enjoyed the video. Okay, thanks, bye.